In the picturesque community of Oakwood Hills, rows of gleaming houses lined the winding streets, and immaculate lawns stretched out like green carpets. It was the type of suburban haven that many families considered their ideal home, complete with well-kept parks, friendly sidewalks perfect for dog walkers, and a reputedly tight-knit homeowners association that vowed to keep the neighborhood pleasant for everyone. But beneath Oakwood Hill's impeccable surface, tensions sometimes flared. The eye of these tensions often revolved around a particular woman named Beatrice Wilcox, though few called her that to her face. She much preferred her nickname, Karen, which she adopted after overhearing a younger neighbor sarcastically refer to her as such. Rather than take offense, Karen embraced the moniker, twisting it into her badge of self-importance. Karen's house, perched on the neighborhood's highest corner lot, practically glowed under the midday sun. It boasted fresh coats of eggshell white paint, meticulously trimmed shrubs cut into geometric perfection, and flower beds that blossomed in symmetrical patterns. She took these external details very seriously, believing that a yard's crispness reflected a homeowner's moral standing. If one lazy resident allowed dandelions to sprout on their lawn, Karen called it a crime against aesthetics. And if children chalked colorful drawings on the sidewalk, she insisted it was graffiti. She wore her HOA membership like a badge of honor. Only she didn't just carry the badge, she enforced it with unrelenting zeal. It hadn't always been this way. Or at least, some longtime residents recalled a period when Beatrice was quieter. But after her second divorce 5 years ago, she became Oakwood Hill's self-appointed guardian of rules and regulations. Despite only serving officially as treasurer within the HOA, Karen asserted her authority far beyond her title. She pored over the association's covenant documents late into the night, highlighting every permissible or forbidden nuance, memorizing bylaws that most people didn't even know existed. Far from content with day-to-day tasks, she believed the board should proactively micromanage every corner of Oakwood Hills. And because of her forceful personality, many neighbors simply cowered in compliance. On Saturday mornings, the local park at Oakwood Hills drew families for a variety of activities. Children darted across the playground, dogs tugged on leashes, and people strolled by the little duck pond with slices of bread for the mallards. The park was small but impeccably maintained, framed by tall trees that offered shade on hot days. A well-paved path looped around the central lawn, which was big enough for small gatherings or picnics, but never large enough to host major events without prior HOA approval. This was precisely the type of place that seemed perfect for a casual yoga group, at least until Karen took an interest in it. The yoga group started innocently enough. A few mothers in the neighborhood, mostly friends who met through their kids' playdates, realized they all enjoyed gentle exercise and found it helpful to de-stress from the weekly routine. So every Tuesday and Thursday morning, they gathered in a corner of the park to unroll their yoga mats under the oak trees, away from traffic noise. They weren't rowdy or intrusive. They simply wanted a bit of peace, fresh air, and fellowship. Among these women were Alicia Mendez, who taught part-time at a local preschool, Chelsea Holmes, a busy mother of 2 toddlers, and Lydia Brooks, an amateur gardener known for her generosity with homegrown herbs. Each of them took turns sharing simple yoga routines learned from online videos or local studios. Their sessions were short, 30 to 40 minutes at most, and concluded with conversation or coffee. The group soon expanded to include neighbors who noticed them and asked if they could join. Before long, around 10 people participated regularly. They chatted quietly, stretched in comfortable poses, and left the park as neat as they found it. Karen first observed the yoga group from a distance, suspicious of any non-regulated gathering. Standing near a park bench, wearing her crisp khaki capris and polo shirt emblazoned with the HOA emblem, she watched them with narrowed eyes. At first, there was nothing particularly unusual about a few neighbors doing yoga. But over subsequent mornings, Karen's annoyance began to simmer. She was an early riser, and while driving to her spin class one Tuesday, she spotted them in mid-pose. In that moment, she decided that if such an activity was to occur in her neighborhood's public space, it had to fall under the HOA's jurisdiction. They needed written approval. They needed an official schedule. They needed to abide by the guidelines for group use of the park. Truth be told, Oakwood Hills had no specific bylaw forbidding or even limiting occasional gatherings of residents. The park was, after all, public space for the community to enjoy. But Karen's personal sense of regulation far exceeded the typical. What if visitors from outside the neighborhood tried to join? Would the yogis inadvertently damage the grass? Would passers-by feel inconvenienced by their presence? To Karen, these minor questions were monumental. She snapped photos from her phone of the group in warrior pose, prepared to build a case. That Thursday, she marched right up to Alicia Mendez, the unofficial leader of the group, in the middle of a relaxing sun salutation. With all eyes on her, Karen cleared her throat. "Excuse me," she announced, voice dripping with forced politeness. "I'm the HOA treasurer. I have some concerns about what you're doing." Alicia, blinking in surprise, stood up from her mat. The rest of the class exchanged uncertain glances. "What seems to be the problem?" Alicia asked carefully, not wanting to invite conflict. She recognized Karen's face, but had never spoken to her directly. Gossip around the neighborhood portrayed Karen as overbearing, prone to lecturing about rules. Alicia silently hoped for a peaceful conversation. Karen stared at the yoga mats as though they were contraband. "I've noticed you gathering here without official authorization. The Homeowners Association has guidelines for using communal property for group activities. I'm not sure you filed any paperwork for this." Her words were crisp and bureaucratic. "Are you aware you might need permission to conduct classes on HOA-maintained land?" Chelsea Holmes, holding a water bottle, stepped forward. "We're not conducting paid classes," she said. "We're just a few neighbors doing yoga for 30 minutes, twice a week. We're not making noise or leaving trash. And we certainly aren't collecting fees." Karen shook her head vigorously. "It doesn't matter if it's paid. The principle is that you're using the park for a recurring event. Even small gatherings can disrupt the park's intended function." Alicia exchanged glances with the others. "We have no intention of causing disruption. There's plenty of space here. Kids are playing, people walk by, and nobody's complained." Karen tightened her lips. "Nevertheless, I'll need you to cease until you have official approval. A group can't just meet whenever they please. It's about fairness and uniform standards." She took a pen from her purse and scribbled onto a notepad. "I can send you the forms. I'll need the exact times, an outline of your yoga routine, an estimate of how many participants might show up, and evidence of your personal liability insurance in case someone gets hurt." She thrust the slip of paper toward Alicia, who accepted it with wide eyes. Though obviously taken aback, Alicia managed a tight smile. "Sure, we'll look it over." Within days, rumors spread through Oakwood Hills about Karen's intervention. Some neighbors rolled their eyes, complaining that she was overreacting to a harmless activity. Others worried that if the yoga group complied, the HOA might impose new restrictions on any small gathering, even kids' birthday parties in the park. Karen, seemingly unbothered by the whispers, happily kept repeating her stance. "We're just protecting the community from liability." Alicia and her yoga friends debated how to respond. Lydia sighed. "Filing for an official permit for a small yoga get-together sounds ridiculous. But if we don't, Karen might escalate." Chelsea was more defiant. "Why can't we keep gathering? She can't physically stop us. We're not doing anything wrong." Alicia worried about turning the situation into a bigger drama. After a tense discussion, they decided to complete the forms, if only to prove they were following the rules. That weekend, they submitted a politely written request to the HOA, detailing their modest schedule: Tuesdays and Thursdays, 8 a.m. to 8:40 a.m., maximum 10 people, no music or large equipment, no fees involved. Karen responded, in typical fashion, with a new round of demands. Not only did she want the schedule in writing, she insisted the group adopt a safety policy, including waivers from each participant that held the HOA harmless in case of injury. "This is standard procedure," Karen wrote, though nobody else had heard of such a policy for a neighborhood park. Many suspected she was fabricating requirements from thin air. Even so, to keep the peace, the group tried to comply. By now, what had once been an informal, friendly get-together was bogged down in administrative tangles. Despite these hurdles, the yoga sessions continued in a subdued manner. Alicia decided to quietly meet on Tuesday morning with just a few close friends while the HOA review was pending. Karen, ever alert, wasn't pleased. She stormed into the park mid-class, exclaiming, "You can't meet until the review is complete. This is a violation." Her face reddened as she jabbed a finger toward the mats. Chelsea calmly pointed out that the park was public property. "We're not blocking anyone from using the park," she said. "We haven't set up any signs or banners. We're just standing here, stretching." Karen's volume rose. "It's about principle. You need the official green light. Also, we don't need to see your downward dog in public. You all should be stretching inside your homes if you lack the decency to follow the rules." Her words stung, especially since many of these mothers found yoga to be a rare moment of respite from hectic family life. Several onlookers were appalled at Karen's outburst. The group ended early that day to avoid further conflict. Over the next week, tension in Oakwood Hills sharpened. Some residents quietly cheered on the yoga group for standing up to Karen. Others dreaded more drama at the next HOA meeting. True to form, Karen penned a motion to impose strict guidelines on repetitive group gatherings at the park, labeling them a nuisance. The existing HOA board, however, was not entirely sold. A couple of board members recognized the yoga group as harmless, and they worried about the negative image Karen was cultivating. After all, Oakwood Hills prided itself on community engagement, not on petty micromanagement of simple neighborly activities. But Karen wouldn't back down. She insisted that her motion be considered, propping up arguments about liability, noise, and visual disturbances. The meeting drew a crowd, with neighbors filling the small HOA office to capacity. Karen, wearing a business suit and her characteristic expression of self-righteous indignation, delivered an impassioned speech about the slippery slope that unauthorized gatherings could pose. She called out Alicia by name, accusing her of disregarding protocol. Alicia, feeling cornered, responded that they only sought peaceful exercise, harming nobody. A mild-mannered board member finally asked, "Why not let them finish the pilot period while we finalize the guidelines?" Another suggested that the park belonged to all residents, and short morning stretches shouldn't be a problem. Frustration simmered in Karen's face as she realized support for her crackdown was less than she expected. The board voted to table the motion, effectively allowing the yoga group to continue while they reviewed the proposal. Karen was furious, but for the moment, she was outnumbered. Despite the temporary reprieve, Karen refused to surrender gracefully. She began patrolling the park on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, showing up with a notebook in which she scribbled observations. She would circle the yogis from a distance, as if searching for a reason to shut them down. Was the volume of their conversation disturbing nearby residents? Was their attire inappropriate for a family park? Were they harming the grass or leaving footprints in the dew? Karen's watchful presence made it difficult for anyone to relax. The mothers found themselves rushing through each pose, tossing uneasy glances over their shoulders. Some participants were so unnerved by Karen's scrutiny that they stopped coming. Others, more defiant, continued to show up specifically because they refused to be bullied into staying home. The situation felt surreal, a serene yoga practice caught in a tug-of-war with an HOA official brandishing arcane regulations. On a bright Thursday morning, the group decided to ignore Karen's presence entirely. They unrolled their mats near a cluster of trees, determined to enjoy their session. Karen moved closer and closer, eventually standing just a few feet away. When Alicia's toddler, who had accompanied her that day, scampered onto one of the yoga mats, Karen reprimanded the child. "That is not safe. You're not authorized to let your child wander around in a group exercise space. This is precisely the hazard I warned the board about." Alicia's cheeks burned with embarrassment, and she hustled to scoop up her little one. The class ended in frustration. The final straw came 2 weeks later, when Karen decided that words were no longer enough. On an otherwise peaceful morning, the group had begun their routine with deep breathing. The sun glinted through the leaves, and a gentle breeze brushed the grass. Everyone settled into a quiet calm, until Karen's voice shattered the silence. "What do you think you're doing?" she barked, marching forward. "I thought I told you to wait for the board's final decision." Startled, several participants nearly toppled from their poses. Chelsea tried to keep her voice level. "We were told the board tabled your motion, meaning we could continue until they decide." Karen's nostrils flared. "They tabled the motion because they're coddling you. I'm not letting this stand. You have no right." And then, to the group's horror, she reached down and yanked at one of the yoga mats. Alicia was in mid-stretch, and she stumbled backward. Karen tugged the mat with such force that it nearly tore. Gasps erupted all around. In the confusion, Karen tried to grab another mat, as though physically removing the problem would end the argument. One participant, a grandmother named Evelyn, clutched her mat to her chest in alarm, astonished that things had escalated to this point. "You can't do that," Alicia exclaimed, her voice sharp with anger and shock. Karen, flustered by her own aggression, spat back, "Stretch inside your homes if you insist on these poses. We don't need show-offs in the park." It was a moment that seemed to freeze in everyone's memory. An HOA board member, physically attempting to break up a yoga session by snatching mats in broad daylight. The aftermath of Karen's outburst echoed throughout Oakwood Hills. Word spread fast, not only via neighborhood gossip, but also through social media, where a bystander's photo of Karen yanking a yoga mat circulated among private community groups. The incident ignited strong reactions. Some were furious at Karen for her bullying. Others were simply baffled. How could something as benign as yoga provoke such hostility? Alicia, shaken yet resolute, decided it was time to escalate matters in a constructive way. She and Chelsea, along with several other participants, drafted a formal complaint to the HOA board detailing the incident. They requested an immediate review of Karen's conduct, pointing out that her actions were not only disruptive, but bordered on harassment or even assault. "We've tried to follow procedures," Alicia's letter read, "but Ms. Wilcox has taken it upon herself to police us in ways that violate our rights as residents. We ask the board to clarify whether Oakwood Hills truly welcomes harmless community gatherings, or if we are at the mercy of personal vendettas." The letter garnered wide support, with more than 20 neighbors signing in solidarity. Many appended personal anecdotes of their own run-ins with Karen's micromanaging. The next board meeting was anticipated to be a bombshell. Karen, meanwhile, doubled down. She insisted that her confrontation was justified. "I merely acted to uphold park regulations. If they had listened to me in the first place, none of this would have happened," she declared to anyone who would listen. But fewer and fewer neighbors wanted to hear her side. She discovered that even some of her usual allies were uneasy about her physical aggression. "Taking someone's yoga mat crosses a line," one longtime resident murmured. Whatever happened to just talking it out? People who previously tolerated Karen's strict approach now distanced themselves, anxious not to be associated with her meltdown. At home, Karen clung to a sense of righteous indignation. She spent hours at her computer, combing through outdated municipal codes and obscure legal precedents. If she found anything that could be twisted to justify banning outdoor yoga, she intended to use it. In her mind, it was no longer just about the yoga group. It was about her authority, her sense of order, and her refusal to be bested. She scribbled notes, printed documents, and prepared for the upcoming board meeting with the determination of a prosecutor seeking a conviction. All the while, the yoga mothers felt uneasy. They knew the board meeting might be the turning point, one way or another. Either Karen would face censure for her behavior, or she would succeed in pushing through her proposed restrictions. Eager to show goodwill, the mothers even revised their request to hold the yoga sessions in a more secluded area of the park, one that wouldn't be in direct view of the main path. "We just want to be able to stretch in peace," Lydia said, tired of the drama. At last, the night of the HOA board meeting arrived. A surprisingly large crowd gathered in the small meeting hall, a testament to how divisive Karen's crusade had become. People stood along the walls, some perched on folding chairs when the seats ran out. An undercurrent of tension buzzed in the air. Karen sat at the front table next to the board president, arms folded. Alicia and Chelsea were among the many onlookers, prepared to speak if necessary. Robert Greenfield, the HOA president, began by reading the agenda. Several routine matters were discussed first: landscaping budgets, upcoming community events, though no one paid much attention. All eyes waited for the item labeled Review of Group Park Usage and Conduct. When Robert finally announced it, murmurs rippled through the room. Karen seized the microphone immediately. She launched into a prepared statement, brandishing a dossier of papers. "We must preserve the integrity of our shared spaces," she intoned. "The yoga group, led by Ms. Mendez and her associates, has repeatedly flouted the process. They gather without final approval, they cause public spectacle, and they risk injury on HOA grounds. Our community deserves better than this. She recounted her version of events, painted in dramatic hues, that cast the yoga mothers as unruly dissidents and portrayed herself as a champion for neighborhood standards. When she reached the part about seizing a mat, she claimed, "I only attempted to examine its thickness to ensure it wouldn't damage the grass." That elicited laughter and jeers from some in the audience, which only spurred Karen's indignation. Once Karen finished her lengthy tirade, Robert Greenfield turned to the complainants. Alicia rose, voice steady but clearly tired of the tension. "We've complied with every instruction we were given. We tried to file the correct forms. We offered to move our sessions to a less central area. Still, Ms. Wilcox harassed us, shouted at us, and physically attempted to remove our mats. We only want to do yoga for 30 or 40 minutes, twice a week, with minimal disruption. If the park isn't meant for simple, healthy community activities, then what is it for?" Chelsea chimed in, her voice firmer. "Karen's behavior sets a troubling precedent. Do we allow a single board member to police neighbors in this manner? She acted on her own, without official approval, to break up a peaceful gathering. That's beyond any legitimate HOA authority." Several audience members applauded. Others called out supportive remarks. The tension peaked when someone read from the complaint letter, citing eyewitness accounts of Karen's attempt to yank the mat away. The exasperation in the room was palpable. After a few more testimonies, Robert asked the rest of the board to weigh in. Most members expressed reservations about Karen's approach. One described the yoga group as harmless and praised them for encouraging community well-being. Another pointed out that no official rule actually forbade small group exercises in the park. With calm deliberation, Robert concluded, "Until such time as the board enacts a specific policy, these residents have every right to use the park for non-disruptive activities." The meeting ultimately ended in a humiliating setback for Karen. Not only did the board decline to implement her restrictive motion, but they also voted to formally reprimand her for overstepping her authority. Though she technically retained her seat as treasurer, she was warned that future unilateral actions might lead to removal. Karen's expression during the announcement was stormy, her mouth set in a thin line. Her knuckles whitened around the documents she clutched. If she was furious before, she was livid now. Alicia and Chelsea, meanwhile, exhaled with relief. Neighbors approached to congratulate them, or at least to voice support. It felt like a moral victory. At the same time, they knew Karen's obstinacy wouldn't vanish overnight. "She's not going to give up," Lydia remarked. "But at least we have official backing now." The yoga group resolved to continue meeting, buoyed by the knowledge that most of the community was on their side. Following the board meeting, Karen retreated into a more covert style of interference. The direct confrontation had backfired, so she began planting rumors instead. She'd approach neighbors during their morning walks, cautioning them about the reckless gatherings in the park. She dropped unsubtle hints about potential lawsuits if someone twisted an ankle. She suggested property values might sink if public spectacles became common. But the effect was weaker than she hoped. After all, the board had already announced its stance. Without official sanction, Karen was just a disgruntled homeowner venting her displeasure. This, however, did not stop her from personally harassing the yoga group. Sometimes, while they practiced, Karen would drive by slowly, glowering from her car window. Other times, she'd stroll past with her phone out, snapping pictures in a transparent attempt at intimidation. The group, now half annoyed, half amused, tried their best to ignore her. Deep breaths, Alicia reminded everyone. That's what yoga is about, right? Inner peace. Yet Karen's presence remained a dark cloud over the sessions. Some participants joked about naming a new yoga position, the Karen, where one stands stiffly with arms folded and scowls. Humor offered a release valve, though beneath the laughter, tension lingered. Nobody wanted a repeat of the mat yanking incident. As the weeks passed, the yoga group began to draw more participants, partly due to word of mouth, and partly because the conflict with Karen had attracted attention. Residents curious about the forbidden yoga sessions decided to see for themselves. So a trickle of new faces started showing up in the mornings, discovering that the atmosphere was friendly and the exercise refreshing. Among these newcomers was a soft-spoken retiree, Denise Page, who had overheard her grandchildren talking about that crazy HOA lady. Intrigued, she ventured to the park one Tuesday to watch the yoga class. She was welcomed warmly and decided to join, despite never having done a sun salutation in her life. Another newcomer was Maxine Ross, a busy nurse looking for stress relief after her night shifts. She found the group's camaraderie surprisingly comforting. Before long, the average attendance swelled from 10 to 15, sometimes even 20. They spread out across the grass, making sure to leave plenty of room for others. Far from disturbing the neighborhood, the group actually fostered a friendly, active community vibe. The occasional dog walker or jogger paused to smile or exchange a wave. On a few mornings, passers-by clapped quietly when the group concluded, as if supporting the spirit of the gathering. Karen watched this expansion with dismay. The more popular the yoga sessions became, the less she could pretend they were a fringe nuisance. She seethed at the idea of so many neighbors flouting what she considered her rightful authority. Her frustration reached a boiling point when she noticed that some participants brought small radios to play gentle background music. That triggered her sense of alarm yet again. She immediately scribbled a furious complaint to the board. Noise violations are piling up at the so-called yoga class. They're acting like it's a festival. The board, aware of Karen's pattern, responded coolly. We have no indication that volume levels exceed any local ordinance. Unless you have verifiable decibel readings, there's no basis for this complaint. Undeterred, Karen actually borrowed a decibel meter from an acquaintance who worked in maintenance, planning to sneak up during a session and record evidence. But her plan fell flat. Even at its loudest, the soft music and quiet chatter were well below any threshold. This only added to Karen's humiliation. She grumbled to herself that it was unfair. Nobody supported her stance. The more she tried to sabotage the group, the more they thrived. Ironically, the best publicity for the yoga sessions had become Karen's relentless meddling, which piqued curiosity and sympathy from neighbors. Meanwhile, a new idea began to germinate among the yoga mothers. Since attendance was growing and some participants were brand new to yoga, why not expand it in a more organized way? Chelsea proposed offering free beginner lessons once a month, inviting any resident of Oakwood Hills who wanted to learn basic poses and breathing techniques. Alicia was initially cautious. After all, this might give Karen more ammunition about organized events. But the group realized they now had the board's implicit support, or at least no official opposition, for these harmless gatherings. The plan took shape quickly. They decided on the second Saturday of each month for a beginner workshop, labeling it Yoga in the Park, open to all. Flyers were posted on the neighborhood bulletin boards and emailed through the official HOA mailing list, with permission from the board president, of course. The announcement explained that classes were free, family-friendly, and aimed at promoting health and community unity. The first session was scheduled for late summer, when the weather was typically mild and the grass lush. Karen, upon seeing the flyers, reacted as expected, outrage. She confronted Robert Greenfield, demanding to know why the board would allow such exploitation of HOA grounds. Robert calmly repeated the official stance. As long as the gatherings respected basic park rules, cleanliness, no amplified noise beyond normal conversation, and no obstruction of other residents' use, the board saw no reason to forbid them. Karen stormed out, vowing retribution. When the morning of the first open class arrived, the park buzzed with anticipation. Alicia and Chelsea arrived early to set up small signs guiding newcomers to a flat, shady part of the lawn. They greeted participants, offered suggestions for yoga mats or even towels, and set out a jug of lemon-infused water for anyone who wanted a drink. By 9 o'clock, a sizable group of about 30 people had gathered, young parents, retired folks, a couple of teenagers, and even some passing runners who decided to pause and join. The air felt charged with a rare sense of unity and excitement. Sure enough, Karen appeared. She stood at the perimeter, wearing dark sunglasses and crossing her arms. A few times, she raised her phone as if snapping photos. Most participants recognized her at once, exchanging knowing looks. Yet they carried on as Alicia began the warm-up stretches, encouraging everyone to move at their own pace. Karen drew closer, possibly planning another confrontation. But this time, there were far too many people for her to single out. Instead, she circled around, occasionally muttering or glaring. The class continued, 30 minutes, then 40. The morning sun grew warmer, yet the participants seemed unfazed, buoyed by camaraderie. Finally, As the session concluded, a ripple of applause broke out. People thanked Alicia and Chelsea, praising the gentle introduction and supportive atmosphere. Karen's scowl deepened at the sight of applause. She couldn't banish a gathering of nearly 36 people. She might scold an individual or two, but an entire crowd, some of whom were older, some younger, some well-respected within the neighborhood, was untouchable in that moment. Realizing the futility of direct confrontation, she stomped away. A few of the participants saw her retreat and breathed a sigh of relief. That evening, a flurry of positive comments appeared on the neighborhood's social media page. "Great turnout for yoga in the park," wrote one resident. Another chimed in. "So refreshing to see a truly communal activity. And it's free." The unspoken subtext was that Karen's earlier attempts at sabotage had fueled this wave of positive attention. In a bizarre twist, her interference had become the best marketing for the yoga sessions. Even people who never considered yoga before were now intrigued. Yet behind the scenes, Karen wasn't about to admit defeat. She composed a lengthy letter to the HOA, complaining that the yoga session had ballooned into a major event that made the park feel cluttered and supposedly inconvenienced passersby. But as usual, no one else agreed that a throng of calm, yoga-practicing neighbors was an actual nuisance. The complaint was quietly filed away with the others. The board, having publicly signaled their stance, saw no reason to rehash the issue. In the following weeks, the yoga group proceeded with an air of new confidence. They stuck to their regular Tuesday and Thursday sessions, still modest in size, and continued to hold the open beginner workshop once a month. Each time, turnout was healthy, if not always as large as the first big event. Lydia started bringing small pamphlets on breathing exercises to share with anyone who wanted them, while Chelsea occasionally invited local wellness experts to drop by and demonstrate advanced stretches. It all felt like the epitome of a vibrant, neighborly pastime. Karen loomed in the background, her anger festering. Her attempts to rouse outrage among her few allies fell flat. Even the most rule-focused residents couldn't see a downside to free, benign yoga. Some of her longtime acquaintances gently suggested that she let this go for the sake of neighborhood harmony. But Karen's sense of personal affront wouldn't allow it. She believed that caving in would undermine her authority, that letting others defy her set a dangerous precedent. This stubbornness manifested in small acts of sabotage. One morning, participants discovered that someone had left sprinklers running in the area they used, drenching the grass and making it unpleasant to set down mats. While there was no hard evidence implicating Karen, many suspected her involvement. Another time, a pile of leaves and lawn debris was suspiciously dumped near the class meeting spot. Yet each minor obstacle was quickly handled by the group. People helped rake leaves, move to a drier patch of turf, and carry on. If Karen had hoped to discourage them, she underestimated their resolve. Meanwhile, the communal spirit around these yoga mornings began to influence other aspects of life in Oakwood Hills. Some neighbors formed walking groups, while others started a weekend jogging club. A few residents organized a monthly potluck picnic in the park, where families could share food and conversation. In a way, the conflict with Karen had inadvertently galvanized the neighborhood to explore more social activities. It became almost a running joke. If Karen hates it, it must be something that brings people together. Karen watched with mounting frustration. It was as if her attempts at control had triggered an opposite reaction, one that made the community livelier and more united. Where once she expected to find support for her crackdowns, she now found only polite rebuffs. Even the board members, who had once feared her litigious nature, had grown weary of her endless complaints. They gently, but firmly, began advising her to channel her energy elsewhere. Determined not to concede, Karen lashed onto a new angle: the idea that large gatherings in the park could create parking chaos on nearby streets. She spent mornings documenting any cars parked along the curb, trying to see if the yoga crowd spilled onto neighboring roads. Yet the participants mostly walked from their homes, so her arguments again fell flat. With every failed complaint, Karen felt her influence wane. As autumn approached, the lush green of Oakwood Hills gave way to amber and gold leaves rustling in the breeze. The yoga sessions became even more picturesque, with fallen leaves sometimes scattering across the mats, adding to the season's charm. Attendance dipped slightly on chilly mornings, but the core group remained devoted. They adjusted their attire to include light sweaters and occasionally brought thermoses of hot tea to share. Karen, never one to admit defeat, tried one more dramatic tactic. She marched into the next HOA meeting and dramatically read aloud a list of safety incidents that she claimed had occurred during the yoga sessions: a twisted ankle, which turned out to be from a resident's unrelated morning jog; a toddler tripping on a mat's corner, actually the child of one of Karen's acquaintances who had stumbled chasing a butterfly; and unspecified crowd control concerns. The rest of the board heard her out, but remained unconvinced. Robert Greenfield simply thanked her for her concern and moved on to the next agenda item. It was anticlimactic, and Karen left the meeting with a scowl that seemed permanently etched on her features. Behind the scenes, though, some neighbors began to feel a tinge of sympathy for Karen. Yes, her behavior was overbearing, even hostile, but many recognized an undercurrent of loneliness in her. She lived by herself in that large house on the hill, with no children or family visiting. She spent her free time fixated on HOA matters. A few believed that if Karen had a circle of friends or a hobby, she might have poured her energy into something more positive. Instead, she had turned her identity into the enforcer of neighborhood regulations, which left little room for real connection. At one point, Alicia suggested extending an olive branch. "What if we invite Karen to join us for a beginner class?" The others reacted with incredulity. Could that possibly work? But Alicia reasoned, it's worth trying. She might refuse, but if she sees we're not the enemy, maybe she'll back off. Some participants agreed to the idea, intrigued by the notion of bridging the gap. When Alicia, in a moment of bravery, approached Karen's door with an invitation pamphlet, politely worded, offering a special guest spot at next month's beginner session, Karen refused to open the door. She spoke through the mail slot. "I don't need your yoga, and I certainly don't need your pity. Leave my property immediately." Disappointed but not surprised, Alicia quietly tucked the pamphlet into Karen's mailbox and left. By the time the next month's beginner workshop rolled around, word had spread about the invitation fiasco. Despite Karen's rejection, the session proceeded with unwavering positivity. About 30 neighbors gathered on a crisp Saturday morning, their breath visible in the cool air. Alicia led them through gentle stretches, her voice echoing kindness. Chelsea encouraged everyone to find the calm within themselves, no matter how chaotic life in Oakwood Hills could be. Karen was spotted lurking at a distance, as usual, but for once, she kept her distance. No ranting, no attempts at confiscating mats, no phone camera snapping. She simply watched from behind a hedge, perhaps unsure how to proceed now that direct hostility had repeatedly failed. As the group concluded, a wave of applause rippled through the park once again. Then, in a moment that felt almost poetic, a couple of participants turned and waved in Karen's direction, as if inviting her to come forward. She pivoted on her heel and stalked away. What followed was a sense of finality. The yoga sessions continued to flourish, recognized by nearly everyone in the neighborhood as a wholesome, beneficial routine. The board, true to its promise, didn't impose any new restrictions. Karen's once looming presence diminished to an occasional glare or complaint. In a strange twist, her furious attempts to quash the group had turned it into one of the most prominent, well-supported activities Oakwood Hills had ever seen. The mothers jokingly remarked that if it weren't for Karen, they might still be just a handful of friends meeting quietly in the corner of the park. Now they enjoyed a vibrant community event that brightened many mornings. As the season shifted further into autumn, swirling leaves carpeting the park, Alicia and her friends reflected on how much had changed over a few short months. They recalled the first time Karen stormed into their session, scolding them as if they were delinquents. They remembered the tense HOA meetings, the physical altercation with the yoga mats, and the wave of support that came afterward. It was surreal that such negativity had spurred something so positive and widespread. Families who never met each other before became friends through the monthly workshops. The neighborhood's sense of camaraderie expanded beyond yoga, too, as new clubs formed and more community-driven ideas took root. A few families started a rotating coffee on the porch tradition on Sunday afternoons. Another group organized volunteer efforts for a local soup kitchen. Ironically, Karen's aggression had become a catalyst for unity. Occasionally, neighbors asked Alicia if she felt any lingering resentment toward Karen. Alicia would admit, "I hated how she tried to bully us. But part of me also feels sorry for her. It must be lonely to fight everyone like that." Some suggested sending Karen a letter of thanks for unwittingly popularizing the yoga meetups, but Alicia decided that might be rubbing salt in the wound. Instead, they continued to conduct themselves with the same positivity they hoped would eventually soften Karen's stance. Karen, for her part, withdrew into her meticulously maintained home. Her involvement in the HOA's daily affairs diminished, partly due to the formal reprimand and partly because she realized she lacked the support she once assumed. A handful of her old acquaintances still chatted with her, but few aligned themselves with her anti-yoga crusade. The last big conflict surfaced when she tried to table a motion restricting group size in any official or unofficial capacity at the park. The rest of the board declined to even put it to a vote, citing the consistent feedback from residents who valued open community use of the space. Thus, Karen settled into a quieter existence. She performed her treasurer duties, collecting dues, signing checks for landscaping services, but no longer proactively policed the streets with the same fervor. Perhaps she realized that each new attempt to control the neighbors only isolated her further. Meanwhile, Oakwood Hills carried on, vibrantly and amicably. One brisk December morning, as a light dusting of snow fell over the park, Alicia and Lydia decided to hold a mini yoga session for those hardy enough to brave the cold. Only 5 people showed up, clad in warm leggings and hats, their breath puffing in the air. They laughed as they attempted basic poses without slipping on the frosty grass. In the midst of the session, Alicia noticed a familiar figure in the distance, standing on a park pathway. It was Karen, wearing a thick coat and a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. She lingered there for a moment, her breath fogging. Lydia gave Alicia a small nudge. "Is that her again? Maybe she's here to scold us for freezing in public," she joked quietly. Alicia just smiled and waved. Karen paused, as if deliberating, then turned away once more, disappearing behind the bare trees. There was no confrontation, no yelling, just a silent acknowledgement. When the session ended, Alicia couldn't help but think, maybe one day, she'll give it a rest. Or maybe she's already given up. Regardless, she felt a strange mix of relief and empathy. The conflict that had once dominated their days seemed to be thawing like the snow under the morning sun. The monthly beginner sessions continued into the new year, albeit indoors at the local community center when the weather grew too cold for the park. They became a beloved fixture of Oakwood Hills. Residents of all ages gave yoga a try, forging friendships that carried into daily life. Some folks who started as novices discovered they truly enjoyed the practice and began supplementing the sessions with online tutorials or local studio classes. In due time, yoga in the park became so well known that it even landed a small feature on a local news blog highlighting community activities around the county. The reporter interviewed Alicia, who politely omitted the drama that had sparked the group's growth, focusing instead on the benefits of free, neighborly exercise. The article described Oakwood Hills as a model community for grassroots health initiatives. When that piece circulated, it only solidified the group's position as a cherished neighborhood tradition. Karen, seeing the coverage, must have felt the sting of irony. Her mission to eradicate the yoga gatherings had inadvertently made them more famous, more entrenched in Oakwood Hills culture. She rarely showed her face at the park these days, preferring to monitor things from a distance. Now and then, she wrote letters to the board about various minor issues, parking infractions, holiday decor guidelines, the length of grass. But the unstoppable popularity of yoga was something she no longer confronted head-on. As spring returned, the park burst into bloom, and with it came renewed energy for outdoor yoga classes. On a sunny Saturday morning, the group reconvened in full force at the newly green field. Mothers and fathers, retirees, teenagers, even a few local college students home for the weekend. Dozens of mats dotted the lawn, a cheerful rainbow in the sunlight. Alicia guided them through gentle warm-ups, her voice soft and reassuring, while birds chirped in the background. Standing off to one side, just barely visible, was Karen. She wore a wide-brimmed sun hat and sunglasses, but her posture was unmistakable. For a moment, she stood with her arms folded. Then, slowly, she lowered them to her sides. She watched for a few minutes, her expression unreadable. Eventually, she pivoted and walked away without a word. No one knew precisely what thoughts churned beneath that silent exit: regret, anger, resignation, or something else. But the class continued unabated. The mothers no longer felt threatened by her gaze. By the end of that session, it was clear that the yoga group had become larger than one person's disapproval. Karen's attempts to break the circle of mats had only made it stronger. The group, once a handful of moms seeking peace, had grown into a pillar of the neighborhood. Each downward dog, each warrior pose, stood not just for exercise, but also for community resilience against baseless aggression. In the end, Karen's interference did the opposite of what she intended. It brought attention, supporters, and official backing to the very activity she detested. Now, with dozens of enthusiastic participants, the yoga group was too big to evict from her line of sight. They would keep meeting, keep stretching, keep breathing, and, inadvertently, keep exemplifying the spirit of togetherness that Karen's hostility could never shake.